And we are recording. Hi, Fran. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I'm glad to hear it. As we were just talking about, when we're recording this in November of 2020, we are enjoying some unseasonable weather. So I was lamenting that fact, and you were enjoying that fact. Well, I want to thank you as I close down applications so that things don't pop up all over the screen. But I want to thank you for doing the interview. I definitely look forward to this topic because it's one I don't think, or at least an angle that is not taken on this topic quite often, at least not I've seen. And I want to thank all those who are tuning in to join us for another episode of Did You Know That? ? The channel where I get to talk to interesting people about interesting and sometimes annoying topics. For those of you who are just joining us, I appreciate your curiosity. And hopefully after this episode, you'll hit the subscribe button with the bell so you'll get notified of future episodes. For those returning, I thank you very much for being loyal followers of the channel. Again, my name is Sean O'Rourke. When I'm not interviewing people, I'm helping companies be hacked as a or prepare to be hacked, I should say, as a cyber liability consultant for Combs and Company. And Fran, I'm going to let you tell the good folks who you are and what you do.
Okay, I'm trying to power off everything here. I don't know how to do that. So my name is Fran Harding. I have been working in the area of addiction, particularly prevention programming, which we'll talk about. I started off, believe it or not, in a very small college in Massachusetts. And that's when I got interested in substance abuse, overdose abuse. And then particularly, I was there when the drinking age across the country went from 18 to 21, and I was in the middle of that. I lasted a year, barely. Couldn't wait to get out of that job, and was very fortunate that New York State was looking for someone to work in the unit of substance abuse, or actually back then it was only alcohol prevention. Didn't quite know what that was, so I jumped in, and while I was there for 28 years, I went to many classes and just ended up becoming very much involved in substance abuse prevention. It's sort of like a calling. When you get into, at least this is what I tell my daughters, you'll know when you're into a field that you know belongs to you. And this field belongs to me. I have a lot of it.
Fantastic advice right there, because a lot of people don't necessarily find that path.
Right, and I have a sister that is a treatment for substance abuse specialist, and she's a deputy director of a treatment program in New York State. And I couldn't do that job. I tried when I was in grad school to get involved in halfway houses with people with substance abuse. Long story short, that it wasn't a perfect fit. I wanted to go to the other end. I knew we could stop this. And you have to remember, this is when the drinking age just changed. So there was a lot of turbulence. So pass right on 28 years, I got an offer to go to the federal government. And I've worked the last 10 and a half years of being the director for substance abuse prevention for Health and Human Services for the country. I thoroughly enjoyed that, where I got most of my experience, most of my headaches, and most of my challenges. But overall, I really believe I can make a difference. I still feel like I can make a difference. I'm somewhat retired, and now I get to work with whom I want, when I want, and be able to really get down to both the grassroots, higher education, which is another love of mine, and the country as a whole. So I'm kind of living the dream still.
Well, and that is why you are on this episode, because addiction is always a hot topic. Obviously, it was a major topic the last 5 to 6 years, mostly around opioid addiction, overdose, and deaths. But there are a whole host of recognized addictions. And so we're going to get into it, because prevention is usually an area that I think is I don't know, given short shrift or is looked upon with indifference because some people may not think you can prevent addiction. So before we jump into all of that, the
Correct.
first question that I had, and I have my questions right down here, so when I look down, it's just making sure I ask them, is
Me
not
too.
necessarily a clinical definition, but maybe the definition that you apply to what is addiction.
Right. I think most people, thank you for that question, because most people, they don't understand it. And when I tell you what it is, then they may question it and you may get a lot of questions. But addiction is a disease of the brain. It is not just somebody who wants to drink and drink and drink, and then all of a sudden they find out they can't stop drinking. I mean, that is the outcome of the disease. But if you have a predisposition, which you either do or you don't, depending upon your family genes, the disease is in the part of the brain that controls your thought process, your highs and lows. It's the pleasure center of the brain, and I don't want to get technical. So the pleasure center of the brain, if I could use the word kind of broken, I'd rather say a lot more sensitive to alcohol and drugs. So if you continue to increase, most of us who do not have this problem, I'm sorry for this popping up. I don't know how to stop it.
It's quite okay.
Okay.
We're live, so it's good. You know,
Okay.
everybody's got it going on.
Now you'll see all my secrets. But the long story short, if you do have that part of the brain that's very sensitive to alcohol and drugs in your pleasure center, because your pleasure center and your dopamine factors that are in there, the dopamine is what makes us feel good and what makes us feel not so good. You get kind of stuck. I tell the kids when I'm speaking to them, your record gets stuck. And they look at me and they laugh. And that's purposeful because I want their attention, because they don't know what a record is. But it's the same kind of issue. Your brain just keeps processing and wants more and more and more. You know, when you stop exercising, you go on a diet and you gain a little weight, but you still want more of what you had because maybe you're a little bit more sensitive to sugar. That's what happens to diabetics. Same thing with people with heart disease. If they don't exercise and don't do what the doctor tells them, your heart gets worse and worse. What's the same thing with your brain? It's a very unusual definition, because most people feel it's a failing. And they look at the person like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you stop? Well, it's because I can't. I didn't ask for diabetes and I got diabetes. I didn't ask for heart disease and I got heart disease. I didn't ask to be an addict, but I became an addict. And that is one of the biggest misconceptions of the disease and why it's so difficult for people to get the support they need from family and friends to get well.
And I'll admit that that definition obviously is something of which you're very experienced. Those of us who don't work in that in the arena of prevention or with addiction overall, again, have a tough time with sort of mental disease, and I think that's universal. Maybe I don't want to say out of ignorance, but I think there are a myriad of reasons. And I want to come back to that to talk about separately, because addiction, I want to sort of see if you think there's an expanded definition beyond it. But when it comes to prevention, if there's a disease of the brain or a disease based on the fact that you are susceptible to a heightened reaction to alcohol or anything that gives you pleasure, does that reaction differ based on the type of addiction, or is it universally the same? And so is it different if it's drugs versus alcohol, or alcohol versus social media versus gaming versus whatever else that you may qualify as an addict for? Is there a difference between those reactions? And then is there a difference between what you did to prevent that?
Two big different questions. The first one is, I'm told no. I'm told that the symptoms might be different. My desire for cocaine is different than my desire for alcohol. But if my dopamine center is broken, then it's broken. It doesn't matter if it's cigarettes, we'll go to another legal substance. If it's cigarettes, if it's alcohol, or if it's the myriad of drugs that we have seen and looked at and read about and have family members addicted to and the like. Many times, but I have been told, and in many studies, it shows oftentimes it's your first couple of use, your reaction is so euphoric, and that makes sense, right? Because it's a part of the disease that controls euphoria, and it controls tolerance, and whether you can drink or not drink, or can use drugs moderately or not. So I tend to believe, I have to believe it, with all the people I know that I have over the years that are addicted, and have an addiction to something. And we keep adding on to the addiction line, by the way. And you mentioned a couple of them. I spent, when I was in New York State, I spent time working with gambling addiction right in the early years, because I'm old, and right in the early years when addiction, when gambling really started to come through, and people were starting, and younger people
legalized gambling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Once it happened in many of our states, and young people were wasting and using up they don't mean to, but they got on the computers and they basically lost all their money, all their parents' money, and it was just horrible. And what happened? You mentioned mental health issues. Then we had a lot of deaths by suicide because of the addiction and the shame. Not the same. It's not the same, but it's very similar to the reactions that some people have with drugs and alcohol.
So then if the reaction is similar, were your prevention methods similar, or did you have to adjust it depending on what you were going after?
And we don't have to in our field have to change the actual approach. As a matter of fact, the approach is the approach. There are certain steps to prevent it. But remember, I'm not preventing an addict to become an addict. That once that happens, you've gone into the intervention and the treatment realm.
So your sister's realm.
Correct. So everything before, way from the younger kids in elementary school, trying to get them to see right away what addiction is, what use is, what alcohol is, what drugs are, right through high school, which is a big danger area. And then, of course, in higher education, we could do a whole story on that, and what happens to them in their age and then beyond. So we have your messaging is different. What I say to a gambling addict and what I say to an alcoholic, the words are different, but the programming is identical. There are certain stages that we have found that have been very, very effective, particularly when it comes to very noticeable addictions or use or problems, I should say, because hopefully they're not addicted yet if they're working with us. So it's tobacco, marijuana, alcohol, and several other drugs, legal and illegal, even before they get actually to beyond addiction. So if an intervention can't work quickly enough, once it's identified, then they go into the treatment realm. It seems complicated but easy when you see it out on, the progression of illness.
Right. So then let's take your avenue, the areas in which you're an expert and have designed. So you can take either New York State or HHS. What do your programs look like? And then how do they filter down to, I guess everything is handled on a local level or a county level?
Not everything, but most. Yes, most. Okay. When it comes to, let's use the easy one, the legal drugs. So when it comes to the misuse of illegal drugs, when I'm speaking about that, I'm talking about alcohol and tobacco, because when we're talking of anybody under the age of 21, we talk about alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, which basically are illegal drugs. I tried before this interview to see where marijuana fits in there now, and I don't know. And I think the reason why we don't know is because our states are all figuring it out. It's sort of likened to years ago in the 80s when we went from 18 to 21 drinking age. We have to wait for everything to kind of settle. But the process is still the same. So when you're talking about your legal drugs, we do exactly what you're saying, which is we do have a community effect. And the community effect, there is a program model that came from the federal government, and it's called the Strategic Prevention Framework. And the Strategic Prevention Framework has 5 steps. And we bring a community together, which is part of I've always said it should have 5.5 steps, because you have to bring the community together first.
Mm-hmm.
So then the first step is to do an immediate evaluation of what is the problem in your community. Now you got to decide what your community is. I'm trying to kind of jump over because I'm conscious of time, but so
take your time. We're good.
Okay. So your community, let's say your community should involve at minimum the schools, the parent groups, the community organization, whatever it is, all of your health people, if you have a couple of hospitals or some pediatrician group or something, your firefighters, your police officers, et cetera, et cetera. Anybody who's anybody in a community, lawmakers, definitely your politicians. And you bring them in a room, you help them see there are 5 steps in this. First, as I mentioned, you do the evaluation. The second thing, while the evaluation is doing its thing, you bring your community's members together. Now, the easy way, I'm going to go back and forth, so if it gets confusing, let me know. When we're speaking to a community, we say to them, anybody in your community that touches a young person under the age of 21, because alcohol is always involved, that's who you want. Those are the faces you want to see in your community coalition. So you take
Gotcha.
them and everybody else that I talked about, and we put them in a room, and so now they're assembled. So you've done step 2. Step 3 is you take a look. I'm making sure I'm saying these steps in a while. I haven't done them in 2 years. You take you have your evaluation going, you have your group. So now it's capacity building. Your evaluation's done. You look at the areas that you most need to target, and then you decide what kind of capacity and what are the experts you need to help you bring in, and the programs we select. Then you do implementation with particular programs. I know we're going to get to the science. The science is so specific right now with prevention. It's like the untold secret that we can actually go into and select certain programs, and you never want to do more than 2 at the same time, programs that meet your needs of risk in your community. So now you know what you have to do. You put the right people together. You implement the programs that will help mitigate the problem, and the last thing you do, evaluate all over again. That is the simple 5-step process. And there are a lot of names to it and a lot of fancy stuff, but it basically is a almost flawless system. And we have saved many, many communities, schools, families, and et cetera with this.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to break down on there. I mean, and it was just 5 steps, but because you're involving human beings,
right,
there's all sorts going on in there. I mean, on all sorts of levels, because
right,
again, we just got through with an election. So, and I'm always cynical about politics, but anytime you bring a politician in, I always have a fearful image of it turning into a press conference more than an actual, development step. But that said, where did you find that you had the most success? And then where did you find that you sort of could never get the message across? Because I'll be honest with you. I mean, a lot of people who know me know I've never been drunk, never been high. I've never smoked a cigarette, not because of any kind of righteousness, just because I didn't like it. Cigarette smoke gives me massive headaches. Alcohol gives me a fur coating on my tongue. And I've always been sort of into sports and active, so I never wanted anything that would sort of preclude me from being able to do that. So that was more important to me. But I was also a teenager who didn't like to be lectured. who didn't like to be told what to do. There was always that bit of a dichotomy. So understanding your audience is maybe reticent to listen to adults. Again, where did you find the successes, and then where did you have the most difficult times?
We have found that, well, it's different in every community, every state,
Sure.
every country, because we've expanded in several other countries. So the 5-step process is only a process, right? It's all in the implementation of the process and who's at the table at the time. So the first meeting of a community group are always the people you sort of just mentioned. The politicians are involved, the principal is involved, parent group leader is involved. But then when it evolves and it gets down to the work, once they all bless that, yes, we need to have an evaluation, which is not easy. Not easy at all, because the community doesn't want to share their bad news, right? Especially if you have somebody there from the Chamber of Commerce. The last thing they want is for you to share your dirty laundry. Same thing with college campuses, same thing with school districts, same thing for almost families, all of us. We don't want people to know. So that's what the glory of, we have over 100 different programs that have been proven in evidence and science to work on particular areas. So that's what that whole step process is to break it down. So I had a police officer once. He was the chief of a small New York State, but a small village, I'll call it, village town, something like that. And he came to the meetings. We have the meetings once a month, pretty much the same people I've just talked about. And he always sat there with whoever the next level down from him worked with him came. They always came, every single meeting. They never missed, all in uniform, the whole thing, but always looking like a blank stare. So my job and the job of the staff that go out and do this is to get to them and find out, okay, it's not going to be helpful if the chief of police isn't going to back whatever the community wants, correct? So if you want to tell the chief of police that we need more, I just went out of my head, the checkpoints, the more checkpoints on Saturday nights at 10 o'clock, because most students have to have their cars in by 11, depending upon the age. You need to get their buy-in on this. It took only 4 meetings. So that's now 4 months though. Remember, this is a fairly long time. At the end of each meeting, I'd make sure, if it wasn't me, it was my lead staff who were doing this, always check on the people that are the most silent. So at the end of the meeting, I happened to have been there for 3 of the 4 meetings, and I went up to the chief and I said, so chief, do you understand where we're going with this now? Because we were choosing programs by this point. We already had the list of the problems. We chose the problems. Now the community has to choose the program. And he smiled. You have to understand, 4 months. And he smiled and he says, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm more than halfway there. Well, what a success. So but if you don't get the buy-in, it looks like you're just another, expert going into a town, telling the town what to do. And that's not what this process is. Buy-in is essential. So I always say in almost all my speeches, it's through the simplicity of prevention is why it's effective. Now, those 2 things are counterintuitive. Everyone believes that everything has to be very hard and full of data, and you really have to study for years and years and years to implement things. Not with prevention. Prevention is life. We've been doing prevention forever. We also, the other good thing, besides having these over 100 programs that have been tested and grilled and by the best scientists around, we have those to choose from, and it links up. Here's your problem. Here's the program that is worked in, by the way, I forgot the other thing, environment. So not only is it the program designed for the problem you're having, alcohol, marijuana, drugs, teenage pregnancy, all the rest that goes with that, but it also is going to link you up to the type of environment that you're working within, which is also very critical. So the only thing that lacks, the only real frustrating thing in prevention is the lack of money It's not the lack of being able to understand what prevention is. It's A, nobody believes it. B, it takes too long, and it does. It does take a long time because you're changing the way I think, and I'm changing the way you think about something that you don't really didn't put much stock in before. Oh, my kid's 16. Yes, I drank when I was 16. They can drink when they're 16. No, they can't. We now know we can prevent that person from having future problems. Those are all the things. So we're not talking about difficult concepts. What we're talking about is, some people who are very well educated and very feel they know a lot and everything can be solved by science, they kind of poo-poo the program of prevention in a long time. Well, we've changed our tune and we've shown people that we have been able to drive down. And you know when we've done it most recently is in the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis had 4 really difficult pieces that you couldn't kind of get away from, but they were also very easy for a prevention person to knock down. My absolute favorite statistic when I was doing this regularly was that for opioid addiction, that the concept of opioids is that it was shared. Where did you get your opioids from? In the beginning, we know we got them from our doctors. That was the first mistake. They didn't know, we didn't know, now we do. And now doctors, if you notice, do not subscribe high opioids, almost to a fault, where you have to kind of work with them to say, no, I just broke my leg. I need something for 2 days or I'm not going to be able to function.
Right.
To the area, so that was, once we're squeezing that part of the problem, what else happened? I still need my opioids. I'm addicted to them. I was an athlete. I broke my leg severely. I was on opioids. I need more. Nobody's giving them to me. I'm going to get them somewhere, because that's what an addict, like we were talking about, different type of addict, but an addict just the same.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot live without my whatever it is, hydrocodone. Where does it come from? Well, we found out by doing a study, 54% of the opioids that people get that are not given by a doctor are being given or sold by friends and family. So when that statistic came up from the National Institute of Health, I was practically jumping out of my chair. If that's not a prevention message, what is? So we were able to quickly turn it around and use it as a prevention educational tool to our communities to say, parents, roommates, anyone else, brothers, sisters, if you don't use up your medication, that's when you started hearing you must use all the medication in the vial. Do you think a doctor really knows that my size and your size needs the same amount of medication? But I'm going to tell you, you must use all that medication. Well, guess what? Before they start saying that, people didn't do it. I don't need it anymore. I'm not ready. So we keep it in the back of our cupboards until my best friend, my daughter, my husband needs something. I'm going to give it to them. Right. So that was the prevention message. Do not share. And that's when the DEA, Department of Drug Control, that's when they started having their drop-off points of bringing the extra opioids that you didn't use. And now we have those drop-off 2 times a year in the center. So everything kind of connects. It's just that people don't see that as prevention. They're thinking of the school prevention programs where we go in and say, this is 14 ounces of alcohol, of wine versus 12 ounces of beer versus 6 ounces of liquor. We do teach that, some people do, but we've gone far, far away from that. Our goal here is to make sure our people in our country are informed, people in our communities, people in our church, people in our synagogue, people anywhere that comes together as a group. They understand the dangers of overuse of all the medication, and they understand what to do for it or who to go to. Much different and much cheerier.
Yeah, and you brought up, now I have a whole bunch of other questions that just started popping into my head, but we'll get to some of the science behind it and how that's generated. But I had one question, and it totally off topic. But with those drop off of the pills, do you prefer people do that so you can sort of gather data, to your previous point, on how much is not being used and being returned, versus they just say, okay, I don't need it anymore, and they flush it down the toilet?
Well, first, two parts to that. It was a two-part answer to that. The easy part first. Never, never, never flush down toilet. We tell that to everybody, because they are in some of the smaller communities. They were finding they were having trouble in the reservoirs because all of the water would seep into the ground. So never, 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 never.
Okay.
And it was and I make
so
a
don't
joke
flush alligators, and don't flush your
You
drugs.
don't want any. That's right.
Okay. We got it.
That's funny. I'll remember that. But the other part about testing, I don't know, because the DEA does do the pickups. It's there. That's what they do for it's one of the very, very little things that they do for the country. I know that they check the pounds, how much they get in their drop off days. I'm not sure, but I just took a note when you were talking to just find out for you, just because my own curiosity to see. I don't know if they really separate it out, because we ask people to just bring it. And, when when I used to be a part of, arm's length part of that, we wanted everyone to drop off. So we would have people dropping aspirin they've had in their, medicine cabinets, and medicine that were not opioids or any other dangerous drug. They just brought it all. And the DEA was so good about that because they took it all. And now whether I don't know that they separated it, but I still have very good connections with the DEA. So I'll find that out for you.
I would be curious to see if they collect data on how much is not being used. And maybe that would help doctors better prescribe for certain things.
I don't know. I do know doctors have scaled back. And as a matter of fact, a funny little anecdote with that too, in the beginning when that started to happen, when doctors, you might remember, it wasn't that long ago, that doctors, all of a sudden, some doctors decided that they were only going to give, some states even started saying their doctors are not allowed to give more than 5 pills for Ecodone, and the 3 pills for first, second. I mean, that's not good either, believe it or not. I mean, and that's because you can't just take somebody who's been using a huge quantity of addictive medications and then cut them off, because then you have major withdrawal and possible other complications with that. So we had to kind of use this. It's a complicated area.
Oh, no. Well, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because prevention is, it is something worthwhile, even if you're making small incremental changes, because each incremental change gets larger as you move down the line. But so to that end, we're going to get to the science, because I want to talk to you about money. Okay. Who pays for the programs? Let's say state level, because you use the state as an example. How are those funds allocated?
Even at the state level, they're not. There are some states that their state legislature, they give them money for prevention. Well, for drugs. They don't
give the locality money.
They'll give the state. So the state will get will get money, and then they will have some form. Usually it is the form of through a grant. So communities and schools, and now some even are sophisticated enough. I think Westchester County might be, to the point where the county will get a chunk and then they will disperse it. And then in some of the other smaller states, it's really the governor's office almost goes from hand to hand. For the states, though, the states get a lot of their money from 2 different sources. One is from the federal government, and the former agency I worked in at that time, now it changes all the time, right? All leadership has a different idea of what they want to do. But at the time when I was sitting there and working, we had several grants that went out for both prevention, treatment, and recovery. Big move on recovery when we found out that recovery was instrumentally interwoven into prevention and treatment, and that middle piece was important. So federal government gives money, and there are 5 federal agencies that will, and some you would go, really? But there are some of the obvious ones will have grants or will find or have ways to give money. It's the only way you can really give money in an agency, at federal or state. But the state takes the money from the feds and they turn it around.
Right.
They keep some for their program and then they give it out. And now the Office of Substance Abuse Services, they now have money in, I think it's 7 regions across the country, and they give that money there, and they give those 7 regional offices give little smaller grants. And when I say smaller grants, we were giving millions of dollars of grants. Now they're down to hundreds, and depending upon the size of your unit. So money is not, it's always the problem, because especially in prevention, because it's very difficult. If you have I've been in this business for over 30 years, and the attention and the support for prevention hasn't changed a whole lot. It's the group that I'm in, and here's both the positive and the negative. The positive is there is a group called the National Prevention Network, which has representatives from every state and territory in our country. They get together under the National Association of Drug and Alcohol Providers, and they are one in each area, and they're the ones that develop programming and give out the word and help lead most of this activity. The issue is that the money doesn't always go where it needs to go. Depending upon it's always the human beings. It's not the science. The science is there. And if you follow the map, and you select the right program, which is amazing to me, because I've lived through not having these to having these. Mm-hmm. And then we have an organization called the Society for Prevention Research, all made up of prevention scientists. They really started their voice the late 1980s, 88, 89. And then have grown and grown and grown. And they're the ones that have gotten the money from many of these larger conglomerates that have given them money to study a certain thing, to study what kind of prevention program would help you and help me. I'm dealing with little kids, you're dealing with families of addicts, I'm dealing over here with workplace issues, and they have also helped. So the money comes in from the federal government, from the state government, from these large conglomerates that want to give money to organizations, and they go to the Society for Prevention Research, or they go for the National Prevention Network individuals, who then will come together and get money. Always in a coalition setting of sort. That's another.
And it's a big web. I mean, just a big web of stuff.
Aren't you surprised there's more money and programming out there than you probably ever thought?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Prevention is a hidden secret. And I told you, it's because people think prevention is so easy. And it's through the simplicity that A, we're both ignored, and B, people are so surprised when they see how effective it is. Yeah. And it's effective because I'm asking you to do your part just as who you are, being on a blog and doing all blogs about this on a local, federal, state level, and also from the complexity of it, how difficult, because it's all been developed by science, and we have a procedure and a list of programs. If you do not choose the right program, when I started out, there was a program, I won't mention what it was, but it involved puppets for kids. Now, how did anyone think puppets for kids were going to do anything? Yeah. And it made the kids happy, but it didn't go great. So, and then, we've had trial and errors throughout DARE. When
Sure.
DARE started, DARE was every school district wanted a DARE program in their school. Was it effective? It was effective for certain things, but not to the level of helping young people say no.
Yeah.
And I don't really mean say no, because God bless Mrs. Reagan, say no was a nice way to get attention. See, when in the beginning of prevention, everybody had a piece of it, but nobody put it together until the science came.
Right.
And Mrs. Reagan was the same way. Say no to drugs. Yes, of course, everybody wants to say no to drugs. The question is how,
Right.
and what's the circumstance, and et cetera.
Well, again, and also I admit it, I'm an avowed cynic. Prevention
Mhm.
is not a sexy news story.
No.
It doesn't have it doesn't have a visual image of bodies. Doesn't
Right.
have the tragedy of people overdosing or the drama of somebody being resuscitated after overdosing. It's very much I liken it to my world in cyber, my former world, cybersecurity. You get no headlines when nothing is going wrong
Right.
because you're preventing something from happening. You get the headlines once it goes wrong.
Right.
And then everybody forgets about prevention and starts yelling at you, well, why couldn't you have prevented this? Well,
Right.
you didn't see the hundreds of thousands of other attempts that we prevented. We missed one on there. It's the same way I've got to imagine for you, you have probably a ton of statistics on the numbers that you probably prevented from becoming addicted to anything, but nobody really finds that information or that story sexy.
Yeah, and no one really thinks about using those numbers because you don't know the people, whereas because you didn't realize it was a problem to begin with, and that people were actually doing that. But one of the things that I would be remiss before we get off end this, that I think there are a few things that have happened, and I've mentioned most of them, that have changed the world of prevention, and I think has made this country healthier and safer. We always use the two together, but one that has been almost instrumental, and it's both done by the federal level, the state level, and the community level, and that's data collection. We now have more real-time data. When I say real-time data, do you remember you used to have universities would do these big data grabs, and they do the studies, and we'd wait for them to come out, and they come out, and it's like, 2 years old or 3 years old, and it's like, oh, thanks, bud, opioids just happened, and I pushed that away. Same thing. We went from opioids to heroin in a blink. And, it's like I'm on one task force and I turn around and I go, what, heroin? So now we're doing that one. We're always jumping from one drug to another, except for the people who are now doing the heavy data. And the agencies, most of them are federal. I'm sure that states are doing some too, but most of them. So it's the National Institute of Health, the CDC, the SAMHSA, the Mental Health and Services Administration, Prevention and Treatment and Mental Health. It's your bigger agencies, and I could go on. There's a few more that are actually doing. And then you go to the community level, and there are a couple programs at a community level that are both statewide. The Community Anti-Drug Coalition of America, CADCA is their acronym. They fund only communities, and they have over 700 communities they fund and train. And they get the money from the federal government, which is actually from the Office of National Control. And that filters in and some of it ends up in CADCA, and they do theirs. So what we were doing before I left was trying to bring all of this together so that someone like yourself or anyone else who's interested, you can see. Wouldn't it be great to have the ability to every year open up a book and be able to see from all these different agencies what they have? What do they agree with? What don't they agree with? And then, because you have the educators, where I more fall into that kind of area, we know, tell me your problem, show me your data. We're almost this good. we can select the 2 or 3 programs that will almost guarantee, but I never guarantee anything with drugs, but almost guarantee success. You certainly will reduce what you had. You may not, I don't know if we ever can clear it away, but we like our drugs, we like our alcohol, unfortunately. So
well, I mean, if you can better their odds,
oh my goodness,
or their percentages of reducing the risks and whatnot, I mean, that's at least worth the effort.
And you will then walk away from a program knowing 2 or 3 things you can do. I can walk away from a program doing 2 or 3 things I might not have known. There are hot spots, there are hot things. Like when you're a parent and you have anywhere from middle school to high school and on, even college. I mean, my poor daughters, it's amazing. They both walk and talk normally because they've had to live with me, and they tease me. Don't worry, they tease me. But I always used to volunteer to drive them and their friends to all the sports events, to whatever else they were doing. And why? Because I always asked them questions many times so that I'd have more information for my job. And that was when I was just, I know. But you know what? Their friends didn't seem to, they kept answering the question. I didn't grill them. I would ask relevant questions. Like when things would happen. When we once had a president that had a little bit of indiscretion, I would ask questions. I'd always make sure their parents knew I was going to talk about it. But it wasn't always alcohol and drugs. Mostly in my era of raising the girls, it was alcohol, mostly. And I was the one who was fearful because I knew too much. These kids, they weren't, thank goodness. But these are the kind of, another little trick. We would tell parents to go into their children's bedrooms and just sit on their bed and look around. Just look around the rooms. Guarantee you some of the posters that they're going to see and really read what's on there, they're not going to like. Perfect opportunity to talk. And never talk to a child that's high or drunk. Never, never, never. Wait till the next morning. The simple, that's what I mean by simplicity.
I mean, I learned that in college, dealing with roommates and friends and whatnot. Never have conversations with them because you're going to get nothing out of it.
No, nothing good anyway. So
I still have people who owe me money, and I've been out of school forever. And by the way, you mentioned you have daughters, and if anybody who is a watcher of this channel, you will recognize the last name of Fran's last name, because her daughter actually was on an earlier episode on another very fascinating topic of election law. And so you are my first mother-daughter
wonderful. I hope I do as well as Rachel does, because she was fantastic. She's amazing.
We have already exceeded 40 minutes, so I want to be cognizant of that. But I do have one sort of semi-humorous, but not question.
Okay.
Were you a fan of Breaking Bad, or did you ever watch Breaking Bad?
I did watch Breaking Bad,
and
but I bet you I watched it for a different reason than most. But
that's what I wanted to get to, because it's like I ask anybody, law enforcement or lawyers, about lawyers, TVs, what have you.
Say I was a fan of Breaking Bad, but it was one of the, and the only reason why I did it is because when I was working down in DC, I lived in DC, so I didn't live at home, so nobody had to know what I was watching. I'm sure that one of my daughters was still home, and the other, my husband, they would have thought I've lost my mind. But they, can I say it this way? Most of the time, I thought that their stories were real. Most of the time. Sometimes they took, artistic liberties or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I think that I don't want to see, here's my problem with these shows. I personally got a lot out of them, made me cringe at times. So, they went off the end a little bit. And I would always check with my friends with the DEA, because the Drug Enforcement Agency, because I don't know not even a quarter of what they do with what they deal with. And I was so fortunate to be able to work very closely. And I even had an invitation to go with them on one of their runs a lot south of us. And no, thank you. I'm not that adventurous, but I can watch it on TV. But I think those are useful to a point. I think that some of their episodes, I wouldn't want a young person who really doesn't understand or doesn't have the type of adults to watch over them and,
Right.
and answer their questions and stuff. I found it to be some cases very, a little, could I say a little too real for me?
Sure, sure.
So
But I
yeah,
mean, that's,
it's an interesting question.
I guess that's a compliment and a good thing to those who created it, that they kept it real. And hopefully the message was not sort of glamorizing
Mm,
his work or what he was doing. I always thought from, and I watch these, I wouldn't say with the kind of criticality that you do because I'm not in that world, but I do watch it to sort of get a sense. Are they made Walter White sort of an anti-hero, just like
yeah.
Tony Soprano.
Yes.
And while I was rooting for him, I knew I would not want to be his friend
Right.
or be in his sphere. And so I was good as long as I was watching it from the outside. But if I
Yeah.
was on the inside, yes, I would definitely not like that individual.
And
So
everything on the edge like that is scary because you don't know. Our country is sometimes difficult to live in, and parents oftentimes have to be here, there, and everywhere to support the family, and they're
mhm,
not watching with the same
right.
programs that the kids are, and they don't have time to come to Fran Harding's community coalition meeting, so they're not getting the same level. That's
Yeah.
why prevention has changed so much, and there are still community coalitions, but they're done in far different ways. They're done over the computers. They have done such, and I have to say they, because I really haven't been hands-on with this, even while I was there, it was happening. But these community coalitions have used everything at their disposal. And it's really under the guidance of the Community Anti-Drug Coalition, of America group, that have really taught these young people to go in and get families and communities together to actually work. So prevention has come such a very long way once we got the science. It was all about bringing the science to the table and then teaching everyone. That was
Right.
the difficult part. And now we even have a couple of universities that have degrees in prevention, if you can believe it, but the prevention and addiction in general. Because I always used to say also, all these phrases that because when you do so many speeches, you have to kind of make it fresh. But I used to hire anybody that came to an interview and said, I don't really know a lot about prevention because I've been working in treatment. I'm almost always, I would say, hired. And the reason why is I would prefer to have the best prevention individuals, because when I was in school, I had to do a halfway house stint, and I had to do a couple of other areas in the treatment area. And I'm like, I would never touch treatment because of that. Well, I think that's the sort of the same premise. I think that if you have to understand treatment and addiction before you can be a good prevention person. Prevention isn't for the people that can't do. Prevention is for people that have a tremendous amount of security among themselves, because you don't often get a lot of claps. You're not telling people. One of my girls used to say, I learned a lot more from my girls than I did anything, I guess. But one of my girls used to say to me, she said, you're always telling people what they don't want to hear. How do you do that every single day? And I thought about it, and I thought I was pretty upgoing, pretty happy person. And when she said that, I started thinking about what we do talk about. And we do use the word no or not or can't a lot. And she's right. So she said to me, she goes, how do you expect young people to listen to you when you're always telling them what not to do? So when I was able to see, sometimes you're in the right position at the right time. I got to know all those professors at the Society for Prevention Research, and we talked about that. And so they were able to start bringing some of the programming in. So it wasn't so much no, 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 but it was why? And you do this, so you prevent that, and you do this. So we have evolved over the last 30 years tremendously, and I hope to be in it longer. I hope nothing
Well,
happens to see it grow.
I got to tell you that you're going to be back for a part two because I got to get to the second half of my questions that I didn't get
I
to.
know. I know.
on this, because again, this is why I like doing the interviews, is because I come to people with predetermined questions just to sort of kick things off. And I usually don't get to half of them.
Right.
Because the conversation just evolves. And I've learned more on this than I think I would have ever learned just sitting down to try to read about prevention like I did prepping for this. I learned a lot more about this just by talking to you. And I hope folks watching this did the same. And I really do think we should do a part 2, because there is the science involved in it. And there is, to your point, what's the message sound like, and how do you get involved with families and whatnot. But again, I want to be respectful of your time, and for everybody watching
Everyone
us.
else watching you, yes.
You know what?
But
maybe we'll leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger.
And can I just throw off some things that you might like reading? Not
Sure.
reading, because it's huge. The Surgeon General, I have this book somewhere. The Surgeon General sent out in 2016, Facing Addiction in America. It's we call it the Surgeon General Report. And I can send you a link. There's a short version, and then there's the big breadth. And it gives you I think it gives you a better feel of when you're, not only myself, but if you were to talk to someone who's treatment specific, you would really know the different pieces to kind of look and bring on. And then the other thing for you and your audience, you're going to laugh at this, and I told you I was old, so I don't mind. In 2007, the Surgeon General Report put out, we called it the Yellow Book at work because it's yellow. And it's the Surgeon General's Report Call to Action for Underage Drinking. It was during a time when we were losing so many young people, and particularly young minds were dropping out of college because of alcohol issues and reactions. Those are just 2. I have a million of them. But
I'll tell you what, I will include those links in the video details.
Okay.
And
any
other
this
links
one's
that
really
you might
old,
think.
it's not that old, because it's still being used today, because some things just don't die. You know?
Well, Fran, this was fantastic. This was
you.
great. It hit all the high notes that I expected. And you know what? I'm not going to, I'll just tell you as a side, you were just as good as Rachel. So we'll leave it as that.
Uh-oh, she'll see that.
Yes, exactly. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Folks,
Thank you.
Be sure I will advertise when there is a part 2. I want to thank everybody for joining us on another episode of Did You Know That? Make sure you hit the subscribe button below. Oh, there's my finger. With the bell so that you'll get notified of future episodes. And until next time, Fran, you be well. And so is everybody out there in the ether.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.